response is going to come by sea as well. So the lack of electrical power is undermining much of the response and leading to cascading effects, including disabled water and sewer systems. The electric grid in Puerto Rico was catastrophically damaged, including 80% of the transmission lines that form the grid's high voltage backbone. Only the underground lines remain functioning on the transmission system. So I'm presenting a resolution to the board which calls on our associate members, our nation's utilities, the U.S. Department of Energy, and others to come together under the SSEB umbrella to provide technical assistance to rebuild the energy infrastructure of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I will be introducing this resolution, and the resolution states, entitled Providing Support to Southern States Energy Board member jurisdictions in the aftermath of hurricane disasters. Whereas recent hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria have impacted several Southern States Energy Board member states and territories, and whereas over 3 million people currently are without electricity in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and whereas these territories lack sufficient resources to quickly rebuild, it can be tasked to assist to this restoration effort. The federal government provides emergency response assistance and funding that can aid in the energy infrastructure restoration effort. Therefore, be it resolved that the Southern States Energy Board will offer support to the governors of Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands and the utilities to restore and rebuild their critical energy infrastructure and coordinate cooperative assistance with its associate members, the nation's energy sector, and the federal government to provide necessary technical support and resources. I introduce this resolution for adoption. Is there a second? I have a second. Any discussion on the resolution? If no discussion, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted, and I thank the board. I do think this is the type of quick action, timely action that represents all the member states very well and will give great support to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. With that, I'll turn it back for the continuation of the program.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you again for your work on behalf of the Southern States Energy Board during your tenure as chair. Good morning. I'm Senate President Pro Tempore from the great state of Mississippi, Terry Burton. It's my honor to be last on the program today, and hopefully we can get you in and out of here. If you will be, Ken, a lady walks into a doctor's office. She's frantically walking around, screaming, "Doctor, doctor, I'm shrinking, I'm shrinking. Why can't you help me?" And he said, "You're going to have to be a little patient." I deserve a 21 grown salute for that. If y'all would be just a little patient, we'll get you out of here so you can enjoy Port Charleston, safe travels home, or whatever you have planned for the rest of the day. As they, if you've ever seen the movie The Wizard of Oz, those things that get in the way of making progress, I like to refer to as flying monkeys. So if we can keep the flying monkeys to a minimum today, we'll be happy. Since 2003, SSEB has managed the Southeast Region and Carbon Sequestration Partnership, one of 7 partnerships supported by the U.S. Department of Energy and its National Energy Technology Lab. The final phase of the project has been the development of a carbon capture pipeline transport and carbon dioxide storage plant project at Plenary near Mobile. Our project here has been highly successful, so successful that NRG Energy from Houston took our 25 megawatt demonstration project and scaled it up to 240 megawatts. This scale up, called Petra is now the world's largest post-combustion carbon capture facility installed on an existing coal-fueled power plant. It came from a Southern States Energy Board project. There are many who deserve credit for this, but most importantly, our Vice Chairman, Representative Randy Davis of Alabama, deserves much credit. He worked with Southern Company and Alabama Power to make our demonstration a reality. For this reason, we refer to Randy as the Godfather of CCAR. This project shows us the power of Southern States Energy Board to bring together government and industry to form partnerships and develop technologies that endure and make a difference. I want to bring up our first speaker to explain the importance of the Petra project. David Greeson is the Vice President of Development of Energy and heads up NRG's carbon capture program. He led that NRG team that successfully developed, financed, and commissioned the $1 billion Petra project. David began his career in the power industry at Houston Lighting and Power and Customer Relations over 35 years ago. He's developed 5 major power projects, which represent over $2.5 billion in investment. Let's welcome David Greeson. David.
Well, thank you, everybody. Power of the gap. So I'm excited to be here today. Why should we think about doing carbon capture? You know, it's expensive, it's risky, we have to talk our commissions and our stakeholders into it. Why should we even think about doing this? By the time I'm done, hopefully in just a few minutes, everyone in this room will be asking, why shouldn't we do carbon capture? So with that, let's hear about the Petra project. We came online in December of last year. Got a lot of pictures for you, so hopefully not too many words. It's a 240 megawatt capture system. It's attached to a 640 megawatt power plant. As you know, we have 18,000 megawatts of wind in the ERCOT interconnect in Texas. It's roughly 25%. And unfortunately, the wind in Texas blows at night when air conditioners are not running. So our coal fleet has to respond to that. When wind is ramping up and supplying a large portion of the needs of the grid, the coal units need to back off because many times with the production tax credit, the wind generators are driving wholesale prices on the grid to negative levels, and $30 per megawatt hour negative is not that unusual in those hours of the day. So we have to be flexible. The size of the capture system was designed to capture the 24/7 portion of the load profile of that power plant. So the carbon capture system runs on a 24/7 basis. It's designed to capture 1.6 million tons per year. That's the equivalent of taking 350,000 cars off U.S. highways every day. The plant is running as expected. The Mitsubishi capture system, I'm pleased to report, thanks to a lot of the work done at Plenary, is performing flawlessly. We think that once we get out of the warranty period and we get full control of how we operate this facility, we'll be able to play with it. We think it'll capture a lot more than 1.6 million tons per year. That'll be a 2018 exercise for the operators of that plant. Probably the most significant thing about this project, and again, thanks to Southern Company, Alabama Power, and the folks who worked on Plant Berry, based on what we learned about how these systems operate, how you can build these systems off of Plant Berry, we were able to bring our plant online on time and on budget, which is very important for NRG and our partners. See, we're an IPP, an independent power company. We don't have a rate base. And so everything we do, every product we sell, whether it's a kilowatt hour or a service of some kind, our customers have a choice. And as much as we'd like to think that we're such good guys and people would love to buy from us, price is what it's all about. And there are websites that all they do is compare price, and people make their decisions in Texas off who they buy the power from, largely on price. So if we had missed the mark on bringing this plant online on time and on budget, we put that in jeopardy. But more than that, this project had to be designed in a way that did not, even if it operated as planned, increase the cost of electricity to the consumers in Texas. It also, in order to accomplish that, couldn't affect the dispatch characteristics of the host coal unit. So when we put this project together, and I'll explain more how we accomplished that, oil revenues pay for everything, from the capture system to the little power plant we built to support the capture system to the pipeline, and all the development in the oil field, 100% is paid for with oil revenues. And the way we configured the plant, there was absolutely no impacts on the operations of the host coal unit. They don't even know we're there. So this is what it looks like. You gotta love the Japanese. They love consistency. And so if you've seen a picture of Plant Berry, this is just a little bit bigger, but it's like they grabbed the corners and just made it bigger on the edges because it is the same configuration. So what we have here is the flue duct bringing the raw gases in from the power plant. It's a 15-foot diameter plastic pipe. And the first stop is in the quencher. This is where we knock down the temperature and take out any remaining sulfur that might be in the flue gas, because sulfur's not allowed, persona non grata, in our capture system. The 340-foot tall absorber is where CO2 is pulled out of the flue gas by dissolving into a solvent known as an amine. Mitsubishi calls their amine KS1, so you'll hear solvent, amine, KS1, it's all the same thing. As the flue gas flows up through the absorber, CO2 comes in contact with the amine. The amine is a molecule that has a socket on it that CO2 just dissolves right into, attaches to. But that bond is not a heat stable bond. In other words, it only is effective at cooler temperatures around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If you heat it up, you break that bond. And so that's exactly what we do in the regenerator, is we move the solvent full of CO2 into the regenerator and heat it up a little bit, and pure CO2 comes out at the top and is gathered in a pipe, sent to a compressor, 27,000 horsepower compressor, about 20 megawatts of electric load, where it's turned into a high density gas, or it actually acts like a liquid and is injected into a carbon steel pipeline. We do dehydration in the compression phase so that the pipeline can be carbon steel. Everything before that touches CO2 is stainless, and that's part of why these things are so expensive. Lastly, these carbon capture systems, whether you're talking about membranes, whether you're talking about solid absorbents or liquid absorbents like our project, they take energy. And you've heard it said, I think typical industry, you think about 30% parasitic load. Well, we decided in our case, because of the restrictions on the host coal unit, it's 35 years old. The last thing we wanted to do was trigger a resource review. So we had to find another way to get steam and power rather than modifying the host coal unit to provide the steam and power. And in our case, because of where we're located in the Kinder Morgan system, natural gas, it's cheap everywhere in the country, but it's really cheap right here. And so we're using natural gas to make steam and electricity in a very efficient, built-for-purpose cogeneration system, which further reduces the parasitic load just because of the efficiencies of providing the parasitic load. 82 miles away, we have an oil field called the West Ranch Oil Field. I will say that on the pipeline to get there, the 82 miles, we did buy American pipe. And I'm here to tell you, you can buy American-made pipe. It was made in Alabama at a SIPCO and coated right next door, and then shipped to Texas by rail. And we competitively bid that, and they beat out the Koreans for supply of that pipe. So don't give up on the pipe industry here in the U.S. just yet. So the West Ranch oil field, it's a legacy oil field. It originally contained 600 million barrels of oil. About half of that has been produced by gravity, just oil that's able to move in that oil field, moves to wells where it's produced. The other half is stuck to the rock. And CO2 has a magic property at about 1 mile down. It acts like Windex. So the first 80 years of this oil field, we were cleaning up Mother Nature's mess by taking all the oil out that could be moved with gravity. And now we're going to use carbon dioxide to clean the rock and make it pristine down there. So we've done some testing, a number of single well chemical tracer tests. In this particular field, everywhere that CO2 comes in contact with oil, that oil moves. And so the challenge then is to make sure CO2 gets in contact with the oil. You can see from this diagram, we're going to be drilling over 300 new wells. Another side benefit of doing this is there were 1,000 legacy wells in this field, none of which can be used in the enhanced oil recovery process. They're just not up to the same standards that we use for carbon dioxide service. So we're having to re-enter and retest all of those wells. Any well that doesn't meet modern standards is plugged and abandoned as a part of this project. So there's a lot of cleanup that is going on as a part of the project. Then lastly, as a part of the DOE grant, we will be writing a report after the 3rd year of operations that talks about what happened to the CO2 that was sequestered in this field. Did it stay where everybody thinks it's going to stay, where the modeling says it's going to stay? And so we've hired the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology to provide a monitoring plan on top of the rigorous plan that the oil field operator has. I would say 90% of the University of Texas plan is already being done by the operator, and so they're cooperating and sharing data. And then for the UT plan to be an umbrella plan, we drilled 10 dedicated monitoring wells for them at their locations where they specified that they should go. They have a service monitoring program. They've drilled some shallow wells where they're sampling CO2, and they're taking water samples from various locations in the field, in addition to all the work that the operator is doing. So we think at the end of the day, we'll know in this field where CO2 went. About half of the capital is a $1 billion project. About half the capital is being spent on the oil field. The capture system itself was not $1 billion. It was about half that. So in the oil field, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of replumbing. Obviously, 300 new wells is a big expense in this field. Given the depth, the wells are about $1 million a piece, so there's $300 million of our capital right there. This is a picture of a central processing facility. There will be 2 of those in our field. This is where the first step in those horizontal tanks in the middle, we separate gas from liquid, and the gas is the CO2 that comes back with the oil. It is recompressed in those buildings on the left, and then re-injected to get more oil. In our field, about 20% of the CO2 injected is lost to the formation or sequestered in dead-end pathways, mineralization, and also dissolves into the formation water. So we get back about 80%. Those compressors compress that and send it back down, commingled with a fresh 20% supply from the power plant. So every day we're injecting about the same amount of CO2. We lose some, that's replaced by CO2 from the power plant. The vertical tanks on the right are where oil and water are separated. Oil is shipped to market, and for mass balances purposes in the oil field, water is re-injected back into the formation where it was produced from. So how do we finance this first-of-a-kind project? I can tell you that no one company, including NRG, was willing to bet $1 billion that this was going to work. But we were willing to bet $300 million. Our partner from Japan, JX Nippon Oil and Gas Exploration, was willing to bet $300 million. And along with the other funding partners, we raised $1 billion. So since some of the folks that were financing this project weren't interested in investing in the full value chain from carbon capture to oil field, we split the project into 2 investment opportunities. First was Petra Parish Holdings. This is the company that owns everything at the power plant. The carbon capture system. It also owns the small cogeneration system. It's owned 50% by NRG and 50% by JX. This is also the company that was the recipient of the $190 million DOE Clean Coal Power Initiative grant. Very thankful to the DOE for not only providing the funds, but they were a real development partner as we went through the process. They had seen how demonstration projects can go off the rails, and so they were quick to raise their hand and say, you might want to rethink that whenever we were at project meetings. So they were a great development partner. And also, as a taxpayer, I was very impressed with their stewardship of taxpayer dollars. We also received, too fast there. We also received a $250 million low-interest project loan from the Japanese government. They used two of their export credit agencies, JBIC and Nexi, to team up to provide that $250 million loan. That rounded out the $1 billion, and we're very grateful for that. So in a way, Japan has over $500 million of this $1 billion project. They actually own more of this project than, or provided funding more than U.S. companies did. So outside the fence at the power plant, we have Texas Coastal Ventures. This company owns the oil field and the pipeline, and is 50% owned by the partners that own everything at the power plant, and 50% owned by a Houston oil company called Tempore Energy, named one of the top places to work in America for like 6 years in a row. I think they pay their employees to fill out the surveys, but actually it's really a great place to work. People just clamor to work there. It's apparently a lot of fun. So where's the industry going? What do we do now that we've got Petra out there? Well, you know, amine systems have got to get cheaper. I testified before 2 different Senate subcommittees in the last month. My number one message to them is carbon capture right now is expensive, and if you want to accelerate the pace of adoption, you need to provide some subsidies. But while you're doing that, believe me, the industry is working on getting costs down. And we really believe that if I were to build another Petra today, it would be 20% less in cost than what we built Petra for. Just with what we know about how that plant operates and some of the systems that didn't need to be as robust as they were. Membrane technologies, this is going to be a great opportunity for natural gas carbon capture that are much smaller. It's a very disruptive technology. Even though it's a young industry, it's a very disruptive opportunity to cut the footprint down dramatically and the cost down dramatically. So we're very excited about the opportunity for that. California will be one of the first targets for that. They have a lot of incentives for low carbon technologies there, and we would likely see a membrane technology project on an existing gas-fired plant in California if things break. And then lastly, solid absorbents are another thing that we're real excited about. Again, the footprint is small. People think of coal plants as big rolling properties, but in reality, they're very congested, and space to put systems like carbon capture systems is often very tight. So footprint is important, and these solid absorbents offer an opportunity to really cut down on that. Well, once you capture the CO2, you got to do something with it, or you haven't done anything. And so right now, enhanced oil recovery is the only way that we have to not only get rid of the volumes of CO2 that need to be put away to make a difference in this climate change debate, but also get paid something for it. There are other possibilities out there. There are bulk materials. NRG is a co-sponsor of an X Prize, where teams are competing to find alternative uses for CO2 than enhanced oil recovery. And there's a lot of great ideas out there. But right now, it looks like those markets are somewhat limited. You know, you can only make so much concrete in a given market before you're starting to pay just for the sake of paving. There are also some people that have come up with ideas to use the carbon dioxide to make food-grade protein. And they're certainly looking to be ways to get rid of a lot of CO2, but on a relative scale, I think I could feed the entire world with the protein they would make from my one carbon capture system. So they've got ways to go on the market there. And then lastly, liquid fuels offer an opportunity. But every time they find a new oil reserve in the Permian or somewhere offshore, it just keeps the oil prices depressed, and so that continues to put pressure on those outlets as well. So if we're going to accelerate this, incentives are going to have to close the gap. We do have an industry that's emerging here. I get calls all the time from universities and labs and venture startups that have ideas. They're looking for opportunities to take their ideas, and eventually they will get to commercial scale. All right, so there are some headwinds going forward. I continue to harp on this. Cost is the name of the game. If you get the cost down, everything else is imminently solvable. But there are other things that could help with that. Right now, Mitsubishi is the only commercial game in town. We need more choices, and I've told them this, and And they are actually working on some of the alternative technologies as well, in addition to working on getting the cost of their system down. But we need more choices. Competition is a consumer's best friend. Scale. Every week I get a call from someone who has a lab-sized idea. And I tell them, NRG is not a technology development company. We're a technology deployment company. So when you're ready to be deployed at commercial scale, give me a call. There are plenty of folks out there that are interested in investing in that technology development phase. We had a unique approach of, I couldn't get oil companies to pay me enough for CO2, but I knew there were big margins on the sale of the oil that was produced from CO2. So in order to get the margins I needed, I had to own the oil company. So NRG literally in 2011 purchased the West Branch oil field. That allowed us to get the margins we needed to cover the cost of carbon capture. That's not the only approach. There are other creative, talented folks out there that can come up with ideas on how to structure these projects so that they'll be successful and be financed. FutureGen, there's been just a lot of, the Clean Energy Project out in West Texas. There's been a lot of projects that didn't make it. And so in the capital markets, we have a real reputation problem. And with so much capital needed to build carbon capture, we've got to restore confidence in those markets so that we can start getting loans and investment from private equity into this space. We can't count on governments to give us subsidies forever. We've got to get these capital markets in. And then lastly, it was 7 years for us from start to finish to develop this project. It takes time. And many of the folks who have sustainability goals all have 2030 big targets. And so if we're going to have carbon capture be a part of the 2030 solutions, we've got to get started now. We're almost out of time for how long it takes to get one of these projects online. All right, so let's talk about economics right quick. This is the problem, and this is the problem that the industry is working on. Right now, enhanced oil recovery is, as I mentioned, the only viable big market for CO2, and you're just not going to find an oil company, in my experience, that's willing to pay more than $2 per MCF. That's about $35 per ton of CO2. Oil companies talk MCFs, and I'm a young, aspiring oil guy now that I'm in oil field. What they'd really rather pay is less than 50 cents per MCF. And this is where we are today with the industry. Well above 350. That's a problem. We're never going to get oil companies to buy at that price. But the industry is working on it. As I mentioned, I think my next project I could bring online in about 5 years at a 20% lower cost. That's about 4% per year improvement, assuming that could be continued. You can see the industry will get into the transactable zone with the oil companies by 2030. But if we can accelerate that with 45Q. So adding in on top of the industry savings that are in that red line, the 45Q credits that have been proposed by the HICANT bill, you can see that we get down into the transactable zone very quickly. And just so nobody's worried that we've overshot and maybe it's too rich, most of the good coal plant opportunities to capture CO2 are not right on top of oil fields. So it's going to take a lot of infrastructure to get the CO2 from the power plants to the sink in the oil fields. So if you add back the cost of pipeline and infrastructure, you can see that in about the 2022 to 2023 timeframe, we're going to be in the zone that oil companies would likely be willing to transact. And guess what? If we started today, that's about when the next project can come online. So hopefully bipartisan support will continue and we'll get the Future Act through Congress, and then you'll see projects popping up all over the place. Because I can tell you from firsthand conversations with the big CO2 EOR, enhanced oil recovery oil companies, they are looking to replace their natural supply of CO2. And they're not, so far, they've been telling me they're not interested in just undercutting their current supply. They just want to replace the pricing in their current supply. I think that natural sources are on the decline, and they're just looking long-term for their company's prospects to be able to continue. They need CO2. So, speaking of infrastructure, the red dots, this is a DOE report from even before I started my project. I'm sure they've updated this by now. This is the one I could find. The red dots are the sinks. This is where CO2 can be put away in great volumes. The green dots represent opportunities to collect CO2 from sources. So, you know, there are thousands of miles of CO2 pipelines. Just because you're in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or even in the southern United States, doesn't mean that we can't reach you, connect you to the sinks where CO2 can be used. We just need the pipelines out there. Right now, Oxy and Kinder Morgan are transmitting CO2, you know, thousands of miles from Colorado and New Mexico into the Permian Basin. Denbury goes about 500 miles with their pipeline here on the Gulf Coast. So pipelines can be done, maybe with a little friction, as we heard from the earlier speaker, but pipelines can be done. So there's a lot of interest right now. My project is 8 months old, and in another few months we'll be approaching a year. I've spoken at this is my 18th conference this year. There have been over 30 articles that have featured the Petra Nova project. There have been over 200 articles that have mentioned the Petra Nova project. We've hosted over 100 tours so far this year. And speaking of that, any of you have constituents or any of you directly want to tour our facility, we're open for business. We'd love to have you. Contact Ken, and he knows how to put you in touch with me, and we'll get you in for a tour, and I'll even buy lunch. We have the privilege of being named Plant of the Year this year. It's a very high honor, and we're really happy about that. But the interest in this project is for one reason. Even though we're only capturing about 40% of the full load amount of the flue gas coming out of this power plant, the carbon footprint of that coal plant, the entire 640 megawatts, is about the same as a natural gas combined cycle plant. So can really make a difference. And when you look at the numbers about what people say we need to do, how much CO2 needs to be put away, carbon capture is the only way to get there. So hopefully now that you've heard my little spiel, you'll ask yourselves not should we do carbon capture, but why shouldn't we do carbon capture? NRG is available. We'd love to help you get started. If you need some help with managing the project, we've got people that can do that. Please call, contact me, let me know. This industry needs more participants than just NRG. We need all of us to jump in and get this thing going. Thank you very much.
Point out the two guys.
Thank you, sir. In the interest of time, if you have questions, we'll try to have some time at the end if we stay on track. Our next speaker comes from the Midcontinent Independent System Operator, or MISO, and will focus on the modernization of the electric grid. Mr. Ken Fonvielle joined MISO in April 2017 as Executive Director of External Affairs, or MISO South. In this role, he is MISO's primary liaison with members, stakeholders, and customers in the southern region, extending over all portions of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. He is a seasoned energy executive with close to 3 decades of experience in all facets of the energy industry, from operations to regulatory compliance, and before joining MISO, he held successive roles of increasingly responsible programs at Charlotte, North Carolina-based Duke Energy Corporation. Let's welcome Mr. Kent Fonvielle.
Thank you, Senator Burton. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and an honor to be speaking on behalf of MISO of our first Southern States Energy Board. Again, it's a fantastic program and experience. I will leave Charleston in the Low Country with a lighter wallet and a heavier self. But very, very enjoyable time. Before diving into the discussion on modernizing, a little bit about MISO. So, who is MISO? Midcontinent Independent System Operator. We're a regional transmission organization. We're a not-for-profit, member-focused organization. That's one of the things that drew me to the organization. It's a great mission. We manage the transmission grid in 15 states, the city of New Orleans, and Manitoba, Canada. So, City of New Orleans, they're their own entity. They're their own regulatory body. That's why they're called out there. My office is in Little Rock, Arkansas, it's our south region. And RTO is like an air traffic controller. So every second of the day, we're managing the electron flow on the transmission grid from Canada to New Orleans to do the following three things. Reliability. Reliability every day, every second of the day, to make sure as lines are taken out of service for maintenance or we lose those lines to storms, that the grid remains stable, reliable, and can serve the critical mission. A little side story, what we have been talking about for the last day and a half here, and what we do as professionals in this industry every day is critically important. And I'll give you a little side story. So we've heard the last couple of days about the storms and the tragedy. So my brother is a regional vice president for the largest kidney dialysis company in the world. He's located here in North America, in the United States. And a day after Hurricane Harvey made landfall in the state of Texas, he was in Corpus Christi as his incident commander for the company. They released his limit on his credit plus vehicles to get to patients so that they could get those patients to life-saving equipment that's powered by electricity. You know, that's what we're talking about here. That's what's critically important. The other function that MISO serves is market efficiency. So overlaid with operating that grid reliably, we're also making sure that the cheapest source of power in that entire footprint every 5 minutes is matched up with the demand for that electricity. And then long-term planning. So we're in charge of, we don't own the transmission assets, we're in charge of planning for reliability for the future. So every year, along with our many stakeholders, we have 416 market participants, many transmission owning utilities. We conduct a planning process every year to develop new transmission projects. In 2016 alone, that resulted in 383 projects, $37 billion of investment in over footprint. So that's a 10% increase in the infrastructure in the marketplace. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit today. So my former colleague Lee Mazzocchi spoke about modernizing the grid, a lot from the distribution perspective, talking about technology. I'm going to focus a little bit more on evolution of the grid. Not sure what the guy in the lower left corner gets paid, but I can assure you it's not enough. As you can see from the guys in the upper left corner, the grid has always modernized, right? So I think it's an evolution. You know, from 1882, when Thomas Edison built the first central power station in Lower Manhattan, I think it was a 100 kW facility, equivalent to supply 1,200 light bulbs. It's $300,000 in that day. You know, think about where we've come from then. The other picture you see here is a picture of our Little Rock Control Center. So we've been in a constant state of change, and what I would say is different today is the pace of change and the complexity of that change is ever increasing. So what are the factors that are driving that change today? And we could probably pick many things, but I'll focus on three main themes today. Computing power, the ability to monitor, collect, and analyze an ever-increasing amount of data is really changing the world around us. So I hold in my hand, the iPhone. It's not one of the new $1,000 iPhones. I'm several generations behind. More computing power than the computers that sent our astronauts to the moon. I made that up, but it's probably close to accurate. So computing power, shale gas, we've heard about that this morning. Shale gas, the abundance of currently low-cost energy is really changing the landscape around us, changing the generation landscape, changing the landscape of the grid that we operate, and technological advances. Not only computing power, but wind and solar prices that are ever decreasing. The amount of effort and energy that's being put into battery storage technology and the cost curve projections that we see on battery storage. I'll admit, I was Progress Energy's renewable manager at one point in my career, and at that point in time, it was very early when North Carolina passed our renewable portfolio standard. I looked at the cost curves that the solar industry was touting and said, that's fiction, we'll never see it. We saw it, and we actually saw it faster than they were projecting. So believe that technology will advance. I will also say environmental regulations, but I would argue today to a lesser extent. I think momentum is a great force of nature, and that momentum has started. It's with us. It will continue. I like to say that there's one very important mathematical equation to keep in mind. I'm a recovering engineer. To keep in mind when you're in the utility industry is utility planning is longer than election cycles. Right? In the future, it will encompass, the technologies that we've heard today. You'll see some themes here in my talk. I was not paid by any of the former presenters. I don't know any of them before today. So the power of computing. What you see here in the lower left is 1980s era analog control room. What I would describe as duct tape on a wall with a lot of light bulbs. That's what we use to control the grid. We did it very well. The grid has been very reliable for decades and decades. What you see in the upper right-hand corner is, again, our Little Rock control room. So we have 3 control centers. We actually have 4, including our backup. One in Eagan, Minnesota for our northern region, one in Carmel, Indiana, which is our central region, our headquarters, and then one in my office in Blue Rock, Arkansas. And you're welcome, any of you that would like to visit Blue Rock, Arkansas. It's a great place. I can attest, just moved there, and we'd love to host you there. MISO has most of the Eastern Interconnect of the United States modeled in our computer system. It is the largest grid model in the world. 6,500 generators are modeled just within our footprint. That's not counting the generators in the rest of the Eastern Interconnect and the RTOs that surround us, but we need to know what's going on in those locations, in those other RTOs, in those other adjacent utilities, because that affects us, because we're all part of the Eastern Interconnect. Over 300,000 data points that are analyzed in our system. So what happens within that computer system? It's an algorithm that runs every 5 minutes of the day that determines what's the most reliable and what's the most cost-effective dispatch of energy at that moment in time. So think about that, 300,000 data points, 6,500 megawatts, 6,500 generators, and it generates approximately 2,500 pricing points on our grid that change every 5 minutes. So to alleviate congestion, to manage the flow of power, this not only increases the reliability and optimizes costs because of the large geographic footprint in which we operate and the very diverse basket of resources that are part of our grid. It has allowed us to add ever increasing amounts of intermittent resources and do it very reliably. We have roughly 16,000 megawatts of wind generation in our footprint today. This next slide, I'll apologize, it's quite busy, but it's 2 things. It's really 2 points. What you see on the left-hand side of the slide is the evolution of our portfolio from 2005 to 2016. It's a little bit small, but take note of 2 things. We were roughly 3/4 coal energy in our footprint. We're now less than half. Part of that is the addition of the South region because of the tremendous amount of gas-fired generation that existed in that South region, really blended that down, but we've also seen, as you've heard this morning, retirements of coal units within our footprint as well. What you see also is growing gas, 27% and growing gas-fired generation. Shale gas has begun to change the game. It's begun to change the landscape. It's the cost of gas-fired generation as that technology advances comes down It's quick to deploy. We heard a lot about permitting cycles and timelines for permit projects, etc. You can get a gas plant on the ground quickly and very cost effectively without a lot of risk. That is really changing the landscape. The other thing you see is, and I'm colorblind, so forgive me, but I think it's green. It should be green because it's renewables. But you see renewables show up in that time frame, 8% and growing. What you see on the right-hand side is that growing piece of what is the future. So the right-hand side of the slide chart is MISO's interconnection queue. So that's all of the folks, because we provide non-discriminatory access to the transmission grid. You want to interconnect to the transmission grid, you bring a project, we study the impacts of the grid, we study what needs to change, and you're allowed to connect with certain criteria. What you see in that is over 60,000 megawatts of new generation that wants to connect to our grid. We peak at roughly 120,000 megawatts in our system. So that's more than half of the load that we have that's trying to reach the grid in new generation. More than 3/4 of that, approaching 80% of that, is wind and solar. More than 80% of the new generation attempting to connect to our grid in our entire footprint is wind and solar. And as you can see, it's not in one region of the country. It's in every region of the country. It will change the landscape along with shale gas. And we have to be prepared to manage that. How does MISO manage that future, that unknown future? Is we have to book in outcomes. So when we do our long-term transmission planning, we have to look at what happens if we stay with our existing fleet, a blended mix of fuels, a diverse basket of resources, all the way through heavy carbon regulation that forces massive shutdown on coal, transition to wind or increasing wind, even further to advanced technologies and a tremendous amount of distributed resources, which is really much different when you begin to get smaller localized generation in the grid. We have to look at those futures, we plan towards those futures, and we pick projects that will work in any of those futures as hopefully a no-regret solution. So as we build projects, we're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to make sure that we can plan for the future and that no matter where our nation goes with its energy mix, that we can manage it and we can maintain reliability. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is storage, and I think you've heard a little bit, this gets to the point of I wasn't paid for this. That storage is cost effective. So we've stored energy as long as we've had a grid. We've stored it in coal piles. We've stored it behind hydroelectric dams. We've even pumped it uphill behind hydroelectric dams so that we could release it in the evening or during the peak of the day, pump it up with nuclear at night, release it during the peak of the day. It's even stored in gas molecules in the ground or in salt cavern storage. And in the future, we'll see it stored in our cars, in batteries on our wall, in grid scale batteries at substations. So what I would say, storage is cost effective. And it's an important resource. Historically, storage has been important to manage intermittent load. I don't know when you're going to turn your light switch on at your home. I'm not sure when a factory is going to shut down or start up. There's variability in load, and therefore we stored energy so that when that load showed up, we could release that energy cost effectively and dispatch it to the grid. What we're having to deal with today is both intermittency of load, but now intermittency of resources, like wind and solar. MISO is fuel agnostic, right? Where we have non-discriminatory access to the grid. What we aren't agnostic about is reliability. So our job is to maintain a reliable grid. We're going to need storage. We're going to need mass storage behind dams that can provide a tremendous amount of bulk power. We're going to need batteries in the future that can respond to higher frequency changes in our grid due to intermittent resources of wind and solar, and it will play a large part in the future. The key things that we need to keep in mind as we move through that transition is how will those distributed resources play within the energy context that we have today? How will it participate in the markets? Will small storage batteries on our homes and our cars, on factories, etc., be able to be aggregated and bid into the market? Where's the intersection of state and federal regulations around these topics? Many of these assets will be connected to our distribution grid, but will play a critical role in supporting the bulk electric system. So how we manage that will be increasingly important as we move forward. I'd like to switch to one concept and see if you can buy into this, is the grid as a battery. Okay, I mentioned that we have 16,000 megawatts of wind on our system today. 16,000 megawatts of 120,000 megawatt peak is fairly significant. When the wind is blowing in the northern part of our footprint and it exceeds our load, with a robust transmission system, we can move that to another part of our footprint where you can leave your gas molecules in storage, where you can leave your coal pile idle, where you can have your nuclear energy available. When the wind stops blowing or decreases, we can move energy back in the other direction. The grid does operate today as the most efficient and cost-effective battery that we have. It will continue to do so. Battery storage in our cars and our homes will not replace that grid. It will supplement that grid, and understanding the attributes that those batteries will provide and disaggregating those functions and understanding the service that they provide and the pricing mechanisms is what we need to focus on. All of these resources will continue to help us our mission, continue our mission of reliable and cost-effective service to our customers. I think this sums up a lot of what I've talked about today. Everybody wants in. That's not a bad thing. Competition and market forces are a great thing. It has kept our nation in a situation where we have a plentiful supply of energy at very affordable costs, and you can flip the light switch on every day. I've been to Puerto Rico before without storms, and my hotel lost power for 5 hours. Grid's not reliable, it hasn't been invested in. Our utilities have modernized the grid for decades. They'll continue to modernize the grid. It is getting more complex. The pace of change is accelerated, but we're up to the task, and we can manage it. Historically, we had limited players in the market, predominantly regulated utilities with an obligation to serve. Now we have many more entrants into this market that may or may not have an obligation to serve. What types of regulations do we put around them, or not, to assure that our customers still have reliable and affordable power? That's what it comes back to. I'll sum up with a couple of takeaways today. The pace of change, as I said, and complexity are accelerating, but we are up to the task. Shale gas is a game changer. That does not mean that we'll have the benefit of $3 gas forever, but we do have it today. It is changing the landscape. It is forcing retirements of baseload units. We're managing through that transition. We'll continue to analyze as a regional transmission organization. Do we get to a point where that's causing grid reliability issues, along with NERC and other folks looking at that? Storage has been, and will continue to be cost effective. All of those storage technologies will play a key role in the future as our grid evolves and changes to more intermittent resources. When the sun's not shining, we'll need other resources to supply power. When the wind's not blowing, we'll need other resources to supply power. And again, we're up to the task. I think the last takeaway is probably the most important, is regulatory and market changes must keep pace. The pace of technology evolution is outrunning us in certain areas. Battery storage technology is one that's going to be complex. We're going to have to decide, who gets to own it, how is it classified, is it a generation asset, is it a transmission asset, what are the attributes. Battery technology can serve one purpose one day, a different purpose another day. How do we define those? How do we price those? And who is, who shows up to the table and carries that obligation to serve? How do we regulate them or not, but ultimately protect the consumers? With that, appreciate your attention. Thanks to the faithful few that hung in there with us. I'll take it.
Thank you, and if there are questions, if we have any time at the end, we will move to those. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Philip D. Moeller, who will share his vision on the future of electricity. Mr. Moeller is Executive Vice President of the Business Operations Group, Regulatory Affairs at the Edison Electric Institute, or EEI. EEI is the association that represents all of the nation's investor-owned electric companies and is a founding SSEB associate member. Mr. Moeller has significant responsibility over a broad range of issues that affect the future structure of the electric power industry and new rules in evolving competitive markets. He has responsibility over the strategic areas of energy supply and finance, environment, energy delivery, energy services, federal and state regulatory issues, and international affairs. Prior to joining EEI in February of 2016, Mr. Moeller was the presidential 2015. Mr. Moeller ended his service as the only Senate-confirmed member of the federal government appointed by both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. At FERC, Mr. Moeller championed policies promoting improved wholesale electricity markets, increasing investment in electric transmission and natural gas pipeline infrastructure. Join me in welcoming Mr. Philip Moeller. Philip.
It's an honor to address you, everyone here, including public officials, governors, representatives. I'm going to work through my presentation pretty quickly. I'm standing between you and some fine food. My main theme, though, is that this electric industry is going through an incredible transformation. In fact, we're actually kind of transcending boundaries that we used to think existed, but are fading away quite quickly. So today I'll go through a few items. I'll talk about some infrastructure investments that have been going on, the transition of the electric fleet, some environmental issues, the evolving energy grid, and some partnerships on resiliency. Some of these themes I've already heard today. You've heard them throughout the conference, even from our morning speakers. Nevertheless, they're important areas, and I'll highlight some changes. So what's driving some of this transformation? You heard it earlier in certain speakers, new technologies, low natural gas prices, technologies changing, need for diversification and emphasis on that, public policies, both at the national and state level, sometimes financial incentives, customer demands that are changing significantly over the last few years, and environmental regulations. Where we've been as a generation fleet basically in the nation, where are we going? Things have changed remarkably in the last few years. You can see historically we're dependent on certain fuel types. That has changed quickly and continues to change. The new capacity, referenced again a few times today, is largely, again, new capacity is largely going to be gas and renewables. For a number of reasons why that's happening, but nevertheless is a fact. Low natural gas prices, Catherine mentioned it this morning, obviously a huge change since the shale revolution came along. Back in particularly the summer of 2008, when we saw prices before the financial collapse, way up there, people didn't like regulators, I'll tell you that, because prices were high and regulators generally got blamed. A year later, in many cases, wholesale power prices fell 50%, largely because the price of gas fell, and that has been, again, largely based on new domestic production that probably 10 years ago, we had no idea was going to be this generous. As companies in our industry, we're actually the ones putting out most of the renewable development. Sometimes that's not very well known. 60% of the solar, almost 100% of the wind. I realize some areas have more of each, but obviously in the southern region, generally speaking, there's a lot of potential for solar capacity increases. What you also need to keep in mind as public policymakers is that if you want to promote solar, or if you are just neutral to it, The cost of it at utility scale, we call it universal scale, is less than half than if you want to put it on rooftop by rooftop. So if you're out there to promote solar, utility scale is the most, by far, cost-effective way to do it. This shows you just how those trend lines have changed remarkably, really, in about the last 10 years. The prices have fallen significantly. Again, technology, as Ken referenced, is driving a lot of that, but this is a real-world factor that is worth considering as you develop energy policy. The environmental issues are, again, one of the transformative set of issues. Paul referenced it a little bit this morning, but there have been a whole suite of environmental regulations. Like them or hate them, they've had a big impact on the energy grid and the choices that policymakers and investors and utilities have made. Multiple air issues, generally speaking climate issues, a little bit changed since the election, but still in particular, again, impact the ability to generate electricity depending on the fuel source. Similarly, land and natural resources and waste management all factor into the complexity of where we're taking the next set of electric generation capacity issues. Again, not probably very well known amongst the public is that the air is getting cleaner, and significantly so. And you can see that at least from the generation side, we've had just incredible reductions in SOx and NOx over the last 30 years. GDP has grown, electricity use has grown. What we're seeing a little bit differently, and this is one of the transformational issues, again, to keep in mind if you're a public policymaker, is that unlike for decades and decades and decades, we're now seeing relatively flat and in some cases declining electricity demand. That impacts things. I'll reference that in a few minutes related to rate making. States are obviously key players, not only because of jealously guarding your rights, but also because this administration is emphasizing issues related to states' rights and has picked a number of key players who come from the states and also embrace these ideals. So, states and your ability to make policy and impact things, it's going to be, frankly, more important than it has been recently. The grid is evolving. This is a big change from, say, 10 years ago. For 100 years plus, we had a one-way energy grid, basically, in terms of power flow, information flow. People would go check the meter once a month, maybe once every 2 months in some areas. Now we've got a two-way system. That is huge and really has changed so much. Because with smart meters, I'll go to that in a little bit, you now have two-way information flow maybe every 5 minutes. That gives the ability to analyze that data, impact customer choices in a completely new way than reading a meter 30 days after somebody's consumed their energy. This is real time. It also allows power flow to go both ways. And that's exciting for those customers who want to do that. Again, I'll get to that. They shouldn't be overcompensated for generating that power, but at least if that's something that they want to do, this system does allow it. Again, the grid was really designed and engineered to be more of a one-way system, so there are challenges in it becoming a two-way system at the local distribution level. But for the most part, this is exciting stuff. It gives customers more options, more ability to control their own consumption, perhaps even generate their own electricity, if that's something that they want to do. However, okay, so I'm a former regulator at the federal level, so I can fall into regulatory geek speak pretty quickly in terms of cost allocation, cost causation. But the challenges are that we're in a pretty traditional way of rate making, particularly at the state level, and because technology is changing so quickly and customer needs and desires are changing so quickly, it's really worth considering the need to do sometimes basic, maybe even more significant regulatory reform because of the fact that these expectations are changing. Technology is moving so quickly, and frankly, it's trying to be squeezed into a traditional regulatory model that was from another era. In the decades past, say there would be a rate case, a element over here, they'd go like this, and then it would take roughly maybe about a year for the utility commission, to figure out a settlement somewhere in between. Now the changes are that we have a lot more players. They tend to be single issue players. They have a lot less likelihood to want to compromise or settle or be part of a larger discussion. That is a challenge when customers are expecting more and quicker. Distributed energy resources are driving a lot of this. Okay, this is tied into, again, this being a two-way grid, unlike before, where it was pretty much one-way information and power flow. This is exciting stuff, but it gets down to the geeky rate-making stuff in terms of if somebody's going to be selling power back into the grid, they should be paid what it's worth. They shouldn't be paid more than it's worth. And if they're getting the full retail rate that you pay, they're not paying their share of the grid cost to maintain and modernize that grid. They're not paying the freight to keep the grid there. And for those people who think, sometimes completely erroneously, that they can get off the grid, well, they're going to find out that because of the needs and based on physics of power flow, it would be incredibly expensive to get off the grid and have your own storage. I remember there's one employee of an electric company on the East Coast, and he's one of these engineers who really got into it, and so he built his own solar system, and he overbuilt it. So a lot more power generated at peak times than he needs. And so he measured all of this, and power that was going to the grid, what he was using. When his HVAC system came on, that was only for a second or so, but he was pulling 400% more power from the grid to start up his HVAC system than he was producing even on an oversized system. So the grid is so important to everyone. If people are talking about getting off the grid, be very skeptical. That's the backbone that allows the rest of this basically to occur. So, as I said earlier, the prices for solar production are going way down in a hurry, but they are still way, way more economical because of the scales issue. If you have a universal utility scale solar than you do at a private rooftop system. States are grappling with this, more so outside of this region than necessarily inside this region, but nevertheless, this goes about how much you pay to produce power in the grid. And if you're getting overpaid, you've got obviously a reason to produce more, but somebody else is paying that freight in terms of maintaining grid investments. The customers are driving things now. It's an exciting time. It's good. It's good for, obviously, customers. It's good for society. But nevertheless, again, price signals are important, and that goes into that kind of geeky world of state rate making, but it's something that's vitally important and getting increasingly important so that we don't have cost shifts of people who can't or don't want to generate power, and they're paying more the freight of those people who do. So, nevertheless, customers are wanting more options, more ability to manage their system. That's a good thing, and utilities will respond. Part of the issue, though, has to do with the right investments into the grid, not only in terms of maintaining it, modernizing it, but if you recall Ken's picture from the last speaker about the control room at MISO, what you have there is you have, compared to maybe decades ago, certainly 15, 20 years ago, incredible visibility into what we call the bulk power system, the wholesale system. So if you go to Carmel, or if you go to Little Rock, or Eagan, Minnesota, you will have incredible visibility in real time. And I urge you to go visit these places because it's great. I find it, well, I could go every day, but I'm a little bit different. Nevertheless, you get incredible visibility as to what's happening in real time at the transmission system. You can see areas that are starting to get congested because of flows. You can see those areas out of service. You can, in some cases, see real-time prices by zone every 5 minutes. That's incredible visibility, and frankly, it's helped the reliability of the system. We are a much more reliable system now than, say, in 2003 when we had a blackout. However, as we transform at the distribution level, at the state level, We need that same kind of visibility into the system and the investments that we have at the bulk power wholesale level to ensure reliability, to enhance customer options, to be able to manage these distributed resources coming onto the grid. And we're having 2 million devices a day being added to the grid. You know, it could be a baby monitor, it could be something like a smart refrigerator with their own unique internet addresses. And that increases the attack vector from the cyber perspective. That's what I'll end with in terms of the topic. So grid modernization is something that, again, almost every state is looking into because of the need to make sure that those investments reflect customers' needs and wants. One of the things you'll be hearing about more and more is these smart communities, which is essentially a way to make people's lives easier. Whether it's better transportation management, whether it's waste management, there's a public safety element to street lighting. We consider the grid as kind of the backbone that enables a lot of this to happen. There's a big communications, telecom element to it, but the electric grid is necessary to maximize the potential of smart communities and smart cities. It's something that's coming. Some places are moving faster than others. Something to be aware of, again, to better meet the needs and concerns of citizens. Smart meters I talked about are really part of the revolution of this transformation because of the fact that we now have 70 million of them in the country. That's basically half of the country. It allows people, again, not only information flowing both ways, but it gives people more ability to manage their consumption and perhaps even make the kind of choices that they prefer in terms of maybe the type of power or the price that they want to pay based on their individual needs. So this is huge, it's continuing, it's transformative, it's something that, again, is a good thing. But the challenge with all this information coming in, because it's an enormous amount of information, almost real time, every 5 minutes, how do you manage that data? How do you make it in a way that not only people have their privacy protected, but that it's managed in a way that consumers, customers can actually use it in a way that they want? That's a big challenge. It's an ongoing challenge because of the amount of data, how to break it down, public policies as to who has access to that data, but mostly how it can be converted into giving customers what they want. Something to watch for, probably something you'll be dealing with, at least in terms of discussions, if not legislation, coming soon if you haven't already. So the next issue, the last issue, is one focused on resiliency, particularly relevant over the last few weeks. First of all, obviously we had Harvey, which was historic in its own nature, but even more so in terms of the number of outages and the impact was Irma. We had a historic storm. We had a historic response. 60,000 members of our community, the electric industry, helping to restore power, a historic recovery. At one point, 7.3 million customers, that's actually accounts out based on Irma. Within a week, 99.9% of them restored. Clearly remarkable, but it's based on a set of relationships that we have between industry and government that is critical. We've basically, as an industry, learned a lot of lessons from Superstorm Sandy. Made sure that these regional assistance groups worked better together, and made sure that the industry and the government work better together. And we're continuing to learn lessons even out of Harvey and Irma. That's the goal, is to make sure that we make it even better. On the other hand, these storms will occur. There will be future outages. We take Florida, we have Florida Power and Light spent about $3 billion hardening their system. It made a significant impact in the ability to restore power sooner, but still, power went out. So, going forward, we want to continue these resiliency investments. We want to make sure that we learn lessons, but nevertheless, these kind of events will happen. We have to respond and make sure we're continually improving. Now that's the physical side of things. That's the storm side. Nevertheless, we also have the ongoing cyber threat. Not only the bulk power system, where there are actually rules that are proposed by something called the North American Electric Reliability Council that are then either approved or rejected by FERC, where I used to work. Or at the distribution level, I talked about 2 million devices being added a day. One of the issues that probably as state officials are going to be confronting a little bit, because the electric industry is the only industry that actually has mandatory and enforceable rules on the reliability side, which includes cyber. But those don't apply to the distribution level that your state utility commissions regulate. So something to keep in mind is how are your state utility commissions dealing with the threat of cybersecurity at this distribution level? It's going to be state by state. A lot of times regulators are really struggling with this because not as many of them have the kind of clearances to get the briefings to know the extent of the threat. Nevertheless, with that attack surface spreading, it's something they are increasingly anxious about, something worth talking to them about in terms of embracing perhaps some of the approaches that some states take, whether it's requiring all their utilities to kind of adopt best practices or come back once a year to ensure that they're on cyber. Just be aware of it as public policy officials because it's an issue that is not going away and is increasing in importance. And again, whether it's at the federal level where we talk about storm response, bulk power system, or whether it's at the state level, with you as state officials dealing with your state regulators, making sure that that's an open channel of communication on this growing set of issues is going to be increasingly important. As I mentioned, investments are important because hardening the grid actually works. But again, sometimes your regulators are going to take a little heat for approving those investments. Again, looking at the experience over the last year, particularly with Andrew, that restoration took basically about 48 hours for most folks in Florida, where it took 2 weeks several years ago in the 2005 storms, largely because of those hardening investments. We talked about the threat landscape. We used to have squirrels up there, which I really liked, but I guess people thought it was a little wacky. But squirrels are actually the most common threat to outages, but they're not on there anymore. You can get a feel for the threat matrix, though. What's more common, what's less common, what has the most impact going forward. That's why we continually work on threat assessment, making sure that the communications between our industry and the government are robust. But there are tough questions. How much do you spend? There's not enough money to make sure that you have absolutely a hardened system that can withstand anything in terms of things we can't imagine going forward. It's a balance. It's a balance, and your regulators are often in a tough spot, but backing them up in terms of how they make those decisions is important going forward so that the right level of investment is made. And I think it's proven, and the analysis over the last, when we go forward with what's happened over the last few weeks, will show that those are great investments because they did a big report, including some people in the room were involved after the 2003 blackout. It was learned a lot of lessons. But one of the things that was, to me, kind of interesting is, people pay a certain price for their electricity. But that's different than the value that they assign to it, especially when they don't have it. And it turns out that it's worth to people way more than they pay for it when they don't have it. And that has certainly proven true to those citizens that have had to undergo not only a loss of power recently, but obviously in Puerto Rico that continues. Electricity can be taken for granted. It is absolutely essential to life, health, and safety, and something to keep in mind when these investments are being made. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to focus on making sure that we're meeting customers' needs. That's going to require some investment. It's an amazing time of transformation in this industry. It's exciting, but there are not only a lot of potentials, there are challenges involved. A lot of it goes down to your regulators, making sure that they have the backup to make tough decisions in terms of meeting customers' needs, expectations, but also making sure that they are cognizant of the need for investing in the grid, modernizing the grid, continual improvement, and then that geeky area rate structures, making sure that some people aren't getting out of paying their fair share of the grid modernization cost is going to be key going forward. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully lunch is coming to you soon. Senator, thanks again for having me, and wish you the best.
Thank you. Three dynamic speakers this morning, a great way to end the conference. I do think that they are all three in the room, and we have a few minutes for questions. If you have any questions of any of our three presenters this morning. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd be interested in David Greeson talking about the role that states can play. Obviously, Ken and SSEB have been very facilitator of that.
David?
I know that's part of his.
Did you hear the question?
I did.
Good.
So the question is, what role do states possibly play? We talked about a $190 million grant for my project, but what I didn't mention was that the state of Texas has passed a very robust set of incentives. We value them on a net present value basis of about $100 million to our project. So we're very grateful for that. The incentives were set up to be success-based, where the DOE grant was given to us to try and do a project. The state incentives only came to us if we were successful in implementing a project. You know, tax incentives, tax breaks, that sort of thing. So yes, states play a very big role.
I have another quick question on your project as well. Have you had enough opportunity, operational experience to determine if it's working the way it's planned?
Yes, it is working as guaranteed by Mitsubishi, and we're very happy with that. We have had a few outages that we've had to deal with things. None of them have been related to carbon capture. The little cogen plant that we built, that's been built, 1,000 times in our industry, has had a number of problems that have taken us offline. The hurricane took us out for 3 weeks. Not at the power plant, but the oil field was in the path of Harvey hurricane force winds, and so it took about 3 weeks to shut down and reestablish operations there.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Renee, I had a technical question. First, on the financing of the project, so it's my understanding the taxpayers own about 20%. Do they recover that money or get a return on that money, or is that just gone?
Yeah, the CCPI program was a grant program, so the money is gone.
Okay. But the other investors will get a return.
The other investors at $50 per barrel will get a return of their dollars over 12 years or so, but it is hardly economic at this point.
Okay. And then I'll take the question, what is your discharge pressure from the CO2 plant? And is it the same as the injection pressure?
So I'm a generating company, and in order to defeat the evil plans of the TDSP in our area, I put all the generation needed to go the entire length of the pipeline inside the power plant as parasitic load, so I don't pay wires charges. The discharge pressure is 1900 psi. It arrives at the oil field at about 1500 psi.
Yes, sir.
For Mr. Moeller, your slide with the threats there, sir, slide 27.
Yes, yeah.
Where did you get your information on how to rank those, and is that available in public?
Yeah, I'll get you that. I think a lot of that was based internally, but it's pretty useful sources, and we use that slide a lot. So thanks for your interest in it. It kind of, I think, gives a good perspective on frequency versus lack of frequency, but impacts relatively minor to some that are potentially catastrophic.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question for Ken. On the grid, oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I agree with you 100%.
The grid is the battery right now.
At what balance of
Generation is the grid,
is the capability of the grid as a battery exceeded?
Yeah, certainly an interesting question. As I mentioned, we undergo long-term planning studies consistently. One that we're kicking off right now is a renewable integration assessment, which basically is how much intermittent generation can you put to the grid before you start seeing what our planning engineers like to call inflection points, which just means drastic change, right? At what point? So we're undergoing that study now. Like I said, we've got 16,000 megawatts of wind on the grid, so more than 10%. You've heard, and we've integrated as a percentage of our load much more than that, increasing to 30% intermittent resources on any given day. You've heard ERCOT, SPP has exceeded, I believe, 50% integration. So the grid is built robustly and can operate it does operate in a two-way flow, and you have a diversity of resources. I think we can see increasing penetration of renewables before we see a quote breakage of the system, but I don't think we'll get to that point. But we are undertaking that. We're going to push that assessment all the way up to what happens when you start approaching 100% renewables. I don't think any of us believe that there's a time scale in the near term that we'll see that, but we just want to go through the study. Great question.
Time for one more question, if anyone has one. Or David can. Okay, that's going to end our session this morning. Let's give all of our presenters a round of applause. Thank you, David, Kent, Philip. We appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, Governor, thank you very much for being here at this entire conference, except for that opportunity you had to take away yesterday. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate your leadership. Mr. Vice Chairman, Godfather, Davis, thank you for what you do. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to our Secretary of the Board, Ken Neiman, for one final business item. Thank you all.
Well, I want to thank all of you for staying. We're not as big as we were yesterday, but we did have an appreciable number of folks stay, and we much appreciate the fact that you did that. I'd like to call our chairman up for one last word from him as to his reflections on the meeting. And I also want to thank him again profusely for his leadership, not over just the past year, but over the past 2 years. He's got us to where we want to be, and we on the staff are very excited moving forward because of the leadership and the direction and the good counsel that he has showed to us. So our chairman again, Governor Asa Hutchinson.
Thank you, Ken. I assure you it'll be a brief moment of reflection, and then we'll head out of here. But, you know, after the 9/11 attack, President Bush asked me to leave Congress to go help set up the new Department of Homeland Security, and I was Undersecretary, and I was told of my responsibility to protect the border systems of the United States from a terrorist attack, all of our immigration systems, all of our airplanes. Someone calculated all of the transactions I was to be responsible for. It was 1.3 billion transactions per year, and the Chief of Staff, General Moeller, sent me a note. Asa, out of 1.3 billion, the challenge, but also if you're going to tackle a big challenge, you got to have a good strategy, you got to utilize technology, you got to utilize partnerships. And I think that is really very similar to where we are today in the energy world. I sit here as governor for most of yesterday and today, and one, I was incredibly impressed with the presentations. I was impressed with the relevance for me as governor on all of these issues, and senators and policymakers that are in the audience. The complexity of the issues struck me, as you can see today, and is emphasized again, the partnership and technology that is essential for our future. And so I believe that as governor, as policymakers, as industry leaders, being here in this room for the past 2 days will help us to have a better roadmap and strategy for the future and help our success. So I want to thank you. I want to thank all the presenters. I think they've been extraordinarily helpful. I look forward to the next time that we convene. And so with that, this session of the Southern States Energy Board will be adjourned. Thank you very much.